Welcome back to Murder Made Fiction, a podcast that looks at fictionalized adaptations of true crime. I'm Joe.
And I'm Jen.
And Jen, we have a very special guest joining us today. So we
We
are
do.
lucky to have William J. Mann, who is the author of the source material we're using to talk about the Black Dahlia all month long. So, everybody, here's the book. So, in case you didn't catch the title reveal, it is Black Dahlia Murder, Monsters, and Madness in Mid-Century Hollywood.
And
And
just have to say, we love that title also.
yes,
Thank you. Thank you.
love an alliteration. Okay,
Mhm.
so William, if you can, we would love it if you could walk us through how you developed this book because it is so incredibly well researched and thorough. And part of me was reading through it and thinking, my God, how long did this take him? But
Mhm.
also, like, how intensive was your process?
It was very intensive. I mean, it was but it was also it's what I love to do. I love to dig out stories. I love to source them back to the originals. I'd like to weigh evidence. Most of my career I've written in, mostly biographies of Hollywood actors and directors. But a few years back, it was actually just about 10 years ago now, I wrote a book called Tinseltown with some alliteration, Murder, Morphine, and Madness at the Dawn of Hollywood.
Ooh.
And it was another unsolved crime, an unsolved murder. And what I really responded to in that project was that I was able to tell more than just one story. I wasn't just taking, one actor or one director and taking them through their lives. I had a multitude of characters, and it allowed me to tell a bigger story too. In that case, about the early film industry and how that murder and the scandal around it really shaped how the American film industry came into being. So I was eager to try it again, and I was coming up with different cases and pitching them to my editor. And he said, none of them are that well known. And I said, well, I'm sorry, I can't give you the Black Dahlia. And he said, well, why not? And I said, well,
Jeez.
because there's been so many books written about the Black Dahlia. He said, well, look into it. And I did. And what I found was that up until that point, there had never really been a book about the case, about the victim, about the community. It was always about, I want to solve this case. I want to find the killer. And so all of the information that I'm going to present in my book supports that theory.
Yeah.
And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to do what I was describing was to um, to tell the bigger story of Los Angeles, of post-war America, and also, just as importantly, the victim, because she has been this cipher in so much of the previous books. She just appears in the first scene, and you find her body. And I really wanted to find Elizabeth Short, and I was more interested in finding Elizabeth Short than I was her killer. So that's where it came from. But as you say, it was an intensive process because although our resources are limited, they're by no means minimal because there's quite a bit, and I had to source through and cross-reference and index everything from the district attorney's office, from what's been released by the LAPD, the FBI records, and then a voluminous amount of press coverage to really try to put that all together, and then try to
Hmm.
interview some people to tie it together. So it was 5 years, and it was an
Okay.
intensive 5 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, and a lot has been written about the Black Dahlia, but I feel like in this century, not so much. We kind of know the name the Black
Right.
Dahlia, and but why do you think people are still so enamored with this case? What is it that drives that curiosity?
Well, I think it's a couple of things. One, the graphic nature of the crime. I mean, there's
Yeah.
the horrible sadistic end to this young woman's life that was really nothing like it before or since. It's people try to say, well, what was the signature of the killer? Well, it's a signature that matches absolutely no one else. But it's also the name. It's also that moniker that the
Hmm.
press gave to her after her death. Nobody ever called her that in life. And and so that has kind of lingered, and it's been absorbed into Hollywood noir, Los Angeles noir. So even when
Hmm.
it's not, if films aren't necessarily about the case or novels, not essentially about the case, there's still echoes of it. The woman who walks by night, who holds secrets, dangerous secrets, a whole cast of killers who wanted her dead. So that template in some ways has been layered onto so many films and novels. I mean, it's the Black Dahlia murder took place in 1947, which is sometimes seen as the birth of film noir. So,
Mm.
so many of these films that come out after that. So, as you say, it's lingered in our cultural memory. People are still interested in it, but not a lot of people know exactly what it was all about.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the things that I was most struck by is that you make the point that what it's about is a young woman who lost her life. And I was reading and almost teared up a little bit when you said her life is more important than her death. I was
Yeah.
really struck by that. And because I think it's something we often lose in the true crime genre. Why was humanizing Elizabeth Short so important to you?
Well, I think because, she represents a period in American history when women were, for the first time, starting to chart their own courses. Marriage and motherhood wasn't an absolute necessity. They were still pressured in that direction, but many young women after the war were seeking their own lives, their own careers. And Elizabeth wasn't so much out there trying to find a career, but she was out there saying, I don't want to get married right now. I don't want to stay in my little suburban town. And, my sisters have gotten married or one of them is engaged. I want to go explore the world. And I thought, she in some ways was a fascinating young woman. Her life was unremarkable because she didn't do any great things or anything, but it's still valuable because she was living her life as she chose.
Hmm.
Yeah, one of the things I really liked is how you paint a picture of her as someone who's a little naive, maybe a little
Yes.
idealistic, but also just kind of wandering around, sort of
Yeah.
taking things day by day. It is really fascinating. I think one of the other elements I really enjoyed is some of your speculations, because there's so much
Mm.
about her life that we don't know. So
Right.
you will frame the conversation as maybe she was doing this, or maybe this is what she was thinking. And I liked that you're not saying definitively this is
Yeah.
what we know, because we just don't,
Right.
but you provide us that kind of insight because you have done the research of what the world is like at that time.
Yeah, I thought I really tried to talk to the reader so this was an ongoing conversation I was having with the reader. So like, okay, we've met Elizabeth so far. Here's what we know. Here's what we don't know. Maybe it was this, maybe it wasn't, but we kind of know her now, so we can maybe start making some, educated guesses.
Right.
And, I actually found her, I felt uh, protective of her in some ways, and especially because I knew what her fate was going to be. But I know plenty of my nieces, 22 years old, and they don't want to get a job quite yet, so they're out there couch surfing among their friends, kind of seeing the world, taking a gap year, and that was Elizabeth, and I really wanted to keep that conversation going with the readers so that they too would come to know her a little bit.
One of the things I also really loved is that you never villainized her or blamed her for that kind of
Right.
free-spirited lifestyle. And I think you also paint a really kind of upsetting picture of the way the media treated
Yeah,
her. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
What do you think about 80 years after this? What do you think we can learn from revisiting the story of Elizabeth Short?
Well, I think it's how distressing in some ways how victims are still often blamed for their assaults, for their murders. Um, we see that in the news right now, constantly, And I think if we can look at how this young woman and her tragic fate was treated by the media, back then it was just newspapers. Now we've got, social media and Instagram and TikTok and all of that, and people are always weighing in on opinions and judgments. And I think if we take a look at, how humanity, how a person's humanity can be so quickly forgotten when they become a story, when they become a big selling story. And if there's anything that I hope people come away from that is, I do propose a possible killer,
Mm-hmm.
but as I said, I was less interested in doing that than I was in trying to find Elizabeth.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about that other half of the book. I mean, probably
Mhm.
more than half the book, because you're also laying out this picture of where the investigation goes sort of
Yes.
awry or maybe just wrong.
Yeah.
There is elements of corruption. There's a bunch of people who aren't fully speaking to each other, but there's also so many suspects and just little
Right.
threads that you have to pull on. So
Right.
we're wondering, like, where do the police and these people who are investigating the crime, where do they lose their way?
I think they lose their way around 1948 when this police psychiatrist, Dr. Joseph DeRiver, kind of, secretly launches this rogue investigation. He's got a book to promote. He has no credentials as a psychiatrist. He's incredibly ambitious. And he lassos this guy in and tries to say this is the killer who had no connection. There was no evidence ever. He then tries to falsify some evidence so that he isn't fired and doesn't lose face. And then the police chief says, "Well, I guess we got to stick by him because we're going to look bad." That's really when it goes off the rails. And at that point that the district attorney comes in and says, "Okay, I've got to take over and I've got to start doing investigation here." And according to the records that are available to us, and many of them are still not because they're held by the LAPD, but up until that point, so that when the district attorney ends his investigation, we have all the records up to that point. And basically there's one guy still standing because they've pretty much eliminated everybody else. But there's one guy still standing. They never come out and say, this is the guy who did it, but it's clearly he's the only one they don't clear. And that's the suspect that I then follow up and try to present the evidence that he might be the killer.
Mhm.
But I also say, look, there is still evidence in the LAPD files that maybe exonerates him. I don't know. So
Right.
until we get those records, we don't know. But I do think goes off the rails around 1948, never gets back on track, though there are a couple of attempts. We know that Finus Brown, who was one of the original detectives, he continued investigating the case at least until the early 1950s. After that, both he and Harry Hansen do retire at the end of that decade in early 1960s, and at that point, it just never really gets picked up again.
Yeah, I will say Deriver is my absolute favorite character. It in some ways because he feels unreal. Like so much of your
Right,
book feels very grounded. I can imagine what these people are doing day to day. And
right.
Deriver feels like a Hollywood creation, someone who
Oh,
is a megalomaniac, just egocentric, a bit of a
yeah,
quack because he's not really that kind of doctor, maybe
right,
not any kind of doctor. I
right.
I loved envisioning him doing stunt casting in my mind. He just jumps off the page to me.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah, he was quite the character to research, and as you say, I kept saying, "Well, wait, he can't be really this bad. There must be something that he's doing there." And I'm saying, "Wait a minute, there's really no, there's no,
No
uh,
redemption.
no redemption for this guy."
Yeah. Well, I was most persuaded by the final theory that you present. And, we want listeners to read, so I'm not going to spoil it. But I thought that seemed to be the one that made the most sense to me. Do you have a preferred theory, or was it tempting to kind of lean towards something, or did you want to keep it more open-ended?
Well, as I said, I think the one who the last suspect standing is remains a very possible and strong suspect.
Hmm.
But I didn't want to like thump my chest and say I've solved the case here,
Yeah.
because there are still records that we don't have. I do think it's interesting that the same suspect that I identify was simultaneously identified by another researcher, and I've been on their podcast, and we both did it at the same time, came to the same conclusion. So maybe if I had to say anything for certain, and this is not going to be very certain, but it's either him or it's somebody else. And
Yeah.
and that somebody else, I think, would be somebody that the detectives never knew,
Hmm.
that Elizabeth just happened to run into that night. That there's no connection, that it was a random stranger. And that's a very unsatisfying conclusion for a true
Yeah.
crime murder mystery. But I think that does remain a possibility.
Yeah. Yeah. And I really admired that restraint as I was reading because a couple of months ago we covered Jack the Ripper, which is another
Mm.
famous unsolved crime.
Oh yeah.
And we covered a television movie where they're like, we're going to solve the crime. And episode 2 tells you who the killer is. And I just, we kind of chuckled at it 40 years later. And so I did really like that you resisted putting your thumb on the scales.
Yeah, I thought that was really important. Little breaking news, though I can't say a name, but the book has been optioned by a pretty big producer. Whether it happens or not remains to be seen. But that's the big question now. Do you keep the ambiguity to this story,
Hmm.
or do they lean in on the suspect that I've pointed out?
Right. Yeah. So, question, you mentioned there are still records that are unsealed. Do you think those will ever open up? And if so, do you think there is a possibility we will ever actually discover who killed Elizabeth Short?
I think it's unlikely that we'll ever know for certain, even if the
Right.
records are open, just because so much time has passed. And people say, well, with DNA, I can't imagine what DNA we'd have,
No.
to
Mhm.
compare. But I do think the records will eventually be open. But when, I don't know. I know the LAPD doesn't like commenting on this case because
Right.
sometimes in the past they've gotten themselves embroiled in things they didn't want to get themselves embroiled in. So
Mhm.
by having this remain an open case, they don't have to comment on open cases, which is what they'll say. Well, it's still open, technically open, so we can't say
Hmm.
anything.
Yeah.
But I do think eventually those records will be open. I mean, it took almost 100 years for the records of the Charles Lindbergh case to be opened, and they're open now. So maybe eventually.
Did you find anything in your research that you weren't able to include either time-wise or I guess not time-wise, like page limit wise or for any other reason?
Oh yeah, I tended to dig so deep that I gave basically biographies for everyone who was on that the
Really?
page. And I would give backstory, and my editor kept saying, this isn't necessary. This isn't necessary. And of course I said, but it is. I really
I was
want to
going to
create the
say,
world.
disagree with your editor. Give it all to
Yeah.
us. We
I
want
was
it
like,
all.
Mhm.
yeah, but I think he made it for a much more readable and
Yeah.
powerful book.
I
Yeah.
do think you can tell that you have affection for some of these I want to say
Yeah.
characters, but they're real people.
They're real
And
people,
Yeah.
absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
But I had to see them as characters because they all have a character arc, really.
yeah.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's what makes for a good book. And
Exactly.
speaking
Yeah.
of, as we noted off the top, there are plenty of adaptations, including
Mm,
maybe, hopefully, a forthcoming one.
yes.
Do you have a personal favorite or one that you think is just ridiculous?
Well, I really love the Brian De Palma film. It has
Okay.
literally nothing to do with Elizabeth Short. They just use her name, but it literally nothing to do with the case except for her name and the manner of her death. I mean, it's completely, I mean, it's not even fictionalized. It's about something completely different, but
Right.
it's an enjoyable film. I think some of the other films that are specifically about, none of the films are really specifically about the case, which is interesting, with the exception of the TV movie from 1975, which was
Hmm.
done I think it was NBC, and we recently showed it in Palm Springs. Lucy Arnaz, who was the star, she was there. It's a typical TV movie. It's not, all that deep, but in some ways it's truer than anything else because Elizabeth comes across sort of as I saw her. It's mostly sympathetic, but the movies that I like that have been inspired by the case, even if they're not specifically about the case, are things like Kiss Me Deadly and LA Confidential.
Yeah.
These films have that um, Black Dahlia noir sense to them, the way that
Hmm.
underground is happening. I wish there had been more fictional attempts on the case because I think it would have kept her story perhaps alive in a way that it
Right.
isn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, in those bygone days of Hollywood and LA culture seem to be kind of a specialty of yours. Do you have any other projects coming up or what's next for you?
Yeah, that's what we're talking about. I mean, I really love this, working in true crime, and I would love to do something else. But we'll have to see. We have to see, what's the right choice to make? What's the next step to make after this?
Yeah. Even what do you want to spend maybe 5 years
Yes,
researching,
exactly.
right?
Yeah.
That has some bearing on it as well.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, William, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. It was great. Once again, folks, if you want to pick up the book, it is Black Dahlia. So it's
Mhm.
Hey,
out now. It's available out in the world. So make sure to check it out and then let William know your thoughts.
Yeah.
great. Yes, please do. Thank you.
Thank you.